Dear learners, welcome you again in this Swayam MOOC course on environmental politics, theories, concepts, and debates, week 6, lecture 2 on major global environmental challenges and their political impact. So, this is the brief outline of the lecture in which I am going to cover the climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and resource depletion as the major global environmental challenges. And then, after, we will be seeing that how these issues are affecting the global relations, security, and economic policies. So here we can see that the world faces unprecedented environmental challenges that threaten the ecosystems, economies, and global stability as well. And here, climate change, which is basically driven by greenhouse gas emissions, which leads to further rising temperatures, extreme weather conditions, and rising sea levels, and which may further comes as the displacing of millions of people and straining the resources, etc. So here, these environmental crises have profound political implications, and climate change fuels migration, conflict, competition over dwindling resources, and influencing international relations and security policies. So here we can see that biodiversity declines and deforestation sparks debates over land use and indigenous rights, while water scarcity heightens regional disputes. And here, environmental policies such as the Paris Accord, which reveals global cooperation challenges with disparities between developed and developing nations over responsibility and funding too. And in this regard, populist movements and corporate lobbying often hinder climate action, prioritizing short term economic gains over sustainability. So, now here we will be seeing that what are the major global challenges in form of changes as climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and resource depletion one by one. And here we will also seeing that how these all are reshaping the world in profound ways with significant political implications. So here firstly we will see a major challenge as climate change. So what is climate change? So here we can see that global warming is a major driver of climate change, which basically here through burning fossil fuels releases greenhouse gases that trap heat and lead to further global warming, which in turn comes as climate change. So here, as we have discussed that how it is driven by greenhouse gas emission, which is one of the most pressing global challenges. So it impacts include rising global temperatures, in extreme weather conditions, sea level rise, and disruptions to ecosystem and agricultural practices. Politically, climate change has become a central issue in both the levels as domestic and international agenda. So these environmental challenges are interconnected and have far-reaching consequences for economies, societies, and international relations. And here, their impact on politics is also multifaceted, influencing policy making, governance, and global cooperation. So now here we will be seeing that what kind of things, policy in form of policies are here. So firstly, we will see the policy shifts, and here governments worldwide are adopting policies. And what kind of policies? Those may reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, to promote renewable energy and also to enhance the climate resilience. In this regard, we can take the example of European Green Deal, which is there to related to carbon pricing mechanisms and national commitments, which falls under the Paris Agreement of 2015. And another one we can see as global geopolitical tensions. And here climate change exhibits resource scarcity, water and arable land leading to conflicts and migration. And in this regard, we can take the example of the problem of droughts in Middle East and Africa, which have further contributed to political instability and displacement of people, which comes here as in form of climate refugees, which is a very fundamental issue in the context of environmental degradation. Now we will see what kind of policies are here as a part of global cooperation. So here climate change has spurred international diplomacy through the different forums like conference of parties forums, which are exclusively for the climate change conferences, which served as platforms for negotiations and collaboration. Negotiations means discussion, and collaboration a kind of collective initiation efforts taken by the different countries. However, it has also highlighted the divisions between the developed and developing nations over the responsibility and funding. As we have seen in the previous lectures too, that how under the CBTR, that is common but differentiated responsibility, as we have seen that how the more responsibility in terms of protecting the environment falls on the shoulders of developed nations, and that is not only in form of cutting down the emission of greenhouse gases, but also in form of providing fund to the developing countries, and also transferring the green technology to developing countries. And that's why we can see a kind of divide is there, as we all know it as a north and south divide over the environmental issue. Now we will see here what is the role of public pressure. So here we can see that growing public awareness and activism, which is mainly, as we have seen in the previous class too, led by the movements like Fridays for Future, which have pushed governments to prioritize climate action, making it a key issue in election as well as in the policy debates. Secondly, now we will be seeing that the another important global environmental issue as biodiversity loss. So here the question comes ki what is called biodiversity loss. So here the rapid decline of species and ecosystems due to habitat destruction, over exploitation of resources, pollution, climate change, which has severe consequences for food security, health and economic stability. And politically, biodiversity loss is gaining attention as a critical issue, because as we are seeing that how the biodiversity loss ultimately led to the situation of environmental conflicts between or among the different countries. Now we will be seeing what kind of policy responses are there in the context of biodiversity loss. So here we can see that countries are increasingly adopting conservation policies like protected areas, wildlife protection laws and sustainable land use practices. In this regard, international agreements like CBD, that is Convention on Biological Diversity, which basically aims to address the biodiversity loss internationally. What are the economic implications of it? So here the loss of biodiversity which are threatening the industries like agriculture, like most of the agriculture of course based on the biodiversity, fisheries and tourism, promoting government to make a balance between the economic development with conservation efforts, conservation of nature. Then here we can see what is the scenario of global inequality. So here we can see that developing nations, which are often host rich biodiversity, are facing challenges in protecting ecosystems while addressing poverty, because it's a kind of like fundamental issue, a critical issue in front of the developing countries, how to maintain a balance between the economic growth and sustainable development. Because as we all know, due to their economic condition of the developing countries, we can see that they are more focusing on the economic growth and other factors which may uplift the situation, economic situation of these developing countries. So this has led to calls for international funding and technology transfer to support the conservation efforts made by the developing countries. Now we will see what are the interconnected crises in the context of biodiversity loss, because as we all know, it's a kind of cycle. These all are like interconnected. So in the same way, biodiversity loss is closely linked to climate change and pollution too, which requires integrated policy approaches, of course, between or among the different nations of the world. And in this regard, like deforestation, the problem of deforestation contributes to both biodiversity loss as well as the carbon emissions, which highlights the need for coordinated action. Now thirdly, we will see the problem of pollution. So this pollution is what basically it includes air pollution, water pollution, and of course the soil contamination, which poses a significant risk to human health, ecosystem, and economies too. And its political impact is evident in both domestic as well as at international context. In this regard, we can see the public health crises, which basically caused by the pollution, like air pollution, for example, has led to public health emergencies in some of the cities like Delhi, Beijing, which have forced the governments to implement stricter regulations and investing the cleaner technologies. Then here we can see what kind of regulatory frameworks are made for it. So here countries are adopting policies to reduce pollution, such as bans on single-use plastics, as we have discussed in the previous class. Such demands to ban the single-use plastic was made by the youth-led movement and activism. Stricter emissions standards and also incentives for waste management and recycling. So here we can see it as a transboundary issue. So pollution often crosses borders, as seen with plastic waste in oceans or air pollution drifting across regions. Like if the problem air pollution is there, so that is not limited within the boundary of a nation, because it can drift across the regions. So this necessitized international cooperation, such as the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, which we will discuss this convention in the coming lectures in more detail. Then we will see what is the status of corporate accountability. So here governments are increasingly holding corporations accountable for pollution, which leads to stricter environmental regulations and corporate initiatives. And lastly, we will see the resource depletion. Resource depletion is what? That is about the depletion of natural resources, and why it occurs due to the over exploitation of natural resources. Natural resources like fresh water, as we are seeing that how groundwater is now gradually depleting, forest, minerals, natural minerals, and fossil fuels. And further, it leads to scarcity and environmental degradation. And here resource depletion has significant political ramification, so which basically manifest in form of resource conflict. Resource conflict, when it occurs, when there is competition for scarce resources like water and arable land, which may further lead to conflicts and geopolitical tensions. And in this regard, we can see the example of dispute over the shared river systems, like between India and Pakistan, the shared river system of the Indus river. In the same way, we can see Nile or Mekong, which have strained relations between the countries. In this regard, we can take the very significant thesis presented by Thomas Homer Dixon. He presented his study in his book Environmental Change and Violent Conflict, in which he basically studied the impact of environmental scarcity on national security and how it further led to the situation of environmental conflict between or among the countries. Now we will be seeing what is the economic vulnerability in this regard. So here nations reliant on natural resource extraction, which may face economic instability as resources dwindle, and this has prompted efforts to diversify economies and transition to sustainable practices. Now here we will be seeing what are and how many political impacts are there of these global changes. So it's an interconnected nature of these environmental challenges which has reshaped political landscape in several ways. Like we can see, firstly we can see the rise of environmental governance. So what is it? So here we can see that governments are increasingly integrating environmental considerations into policy making, leading to the creation of ministries and agencies which are focusing on climate, biodiversity, and sustainability. Secondly, we can see a shift which is also came in political priorities. Here we can see that environmental issues are now central to political platforms, with parties and leaders being judged on their commitment to addressing climate change and other important environmental challenges. Thirdly, we can see the global inequality and justice, and here we can see that the disproportionate impact of environmental crises on vulnerable populations has sparked debates about climate justice and equity, influencing the international negotiations and aid policies too. Now we will be seeing the role of public mobilization. So here we can see some of the grassroots movements and public pressures have forced the governments to take stronger action and making environmental issues a key factor in elections and policy debates. And lastly, that is about the international cooperation and conflict on these global environmental issues. So here we can see that while environmental challenges have spurred cooperation through treaties, agreements, and they have also exhibited tensions over resource allocation, responsibility, and funding. So we can see here that climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and resource depletion are driving significant political changes worldwide. And these global challenges are forcing the governments to rethink the policies, prioritize sustainability, and engage in international cooperation. So now we will be seeing that how these issues are affecting the global relations, security, and economic policies. As we have seen that the interconnected global challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and resource depletion are basically reshaping the global relations, security, and economic policies in profound ways. And these environmental issues are like no longer limited to the realm of ecology and become the central part of geopolitical dynamics, national security strategies, and of course economic planning. And their far reaching impacts are also like forcing, pressurizing the nations to rethink traditional approaches and prioritize sustainability in their policies and in their actions. In terms of global relations, environmental challenges are fostering both cooperation and conflict among nations. How it can be visualized or it can be experienced. So here we can see that on the one hand, international diplomacy has become a critical tool for addressing shared environmental issues, like some of the agreements like the Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, or the CBD, that is here as Convention on Biological Diversity, which is basically signed at the time of Rio Summit of 1992, which demonstrate how nations can come together to set common goals and commitments. And here platforms, some of the platforms like United Nations Climate Change Conferences provides a space for negotiation and collaboration, plus enabling countries to work collectively on such solution. On the other hand, tensions often arise between developed and developing nations over the responsibility and funding. As we have discussed in the previous lecture too, that developed countries which have historically contributed more to environmental degradation, pollution, are often called upon to provide more financial and technological support to the newly independent countries as developing nations. And this dynamic can strain relations if commitments are not met, highlighting the need for equitable solutions. Additionally, transboundary issues like air and water pollution or shared resource depletion require cross-border cooperation, which can sometimes lead to disputes such as those over river systems or fisheries. So in terms of global relations, here we can see that environmental challenges are fostering both cooperation and conflict between or among the nations. Now here we can see that these environmental challenges are basically recognized as threats to global and national security as well. And here climate change in particular is often described as threat multiplier because it intensifies existing vulnerabilities such as poverty, inequality, and weak governance. So before moving forward, quickly here we will see what is this threat multiplier. So basically this threat multiplier, in 2007, Sari Goodman, who served as the first Deputy Under Secretary of Defense for Environmental Security from 1993 to 2001, who coined the term threat multiplier just to describe that how climate change impacted every aspect of national security. So in this context, here we can see that competition for dwindling resources like water, arable land, and minerals can exacerbate tensions which may further lead to conflicts. For example, we can see the water scarcity issue in the regions like Middle East and Africa, which has linked to political instability and violence. In the same way, rising sea levels, extreme weather conditions, and resource depletion are also displacing millions of people, creating them climate refugees. And this migration can strain host countries, lead to social tensions, and destabilize regions. In this regard, we can also see that many countries are now integrating climate change into their national security strategy. How they have identified that if they are want to handle the national security strategy, so they have to incorporate the environmental issues in it too, which recognizes its potential to disrupt military operations, infrastructure, and regional stability. In this regard, the Arctic, which has become a new frontier for geopolitical competition, as melting ice opens up new shipping routes and access to resources. Economically, environmental challenges are driving significant changes in policies and practices as governments and businesses recognize the risk and opportunities which are highly associated with sustainability. And in this regard, countries are increasingly investing in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable infrastructure just to reduce the emissions and also creating jobs. In this regard, some of the policies like carbon pricing, subsidies for clean energy, like we are seeing on electric vehicles, and bans on fossil fuel exploration are becoming more common. At the same time, the physical impact of climate change, which is here as extreme weather events, pose significant risk to the economies. And some of the environmental issues like hurricanes, floods, wildfires can cause billions of dollars in damage, further disrupting supply chains and increasing insurance cost of the companies. In the same way, businesses are also adapting by adopting environmental, social, and governance, which is there as ESG criteria, very much popular, in response to consumer demand, regulatory pressures, and investor expectations. And this shift is a kind of driving innovation in green technology and sustainable practices. While global trade and supply chains are being reshaped by environmental regulations, means now they are making their supply chains and global trade according to the environmental necessities, as carbon border taxes or bans on single use plastic. So here we can see that the interconnected nature of these challenges means that their impact on global relations, security and economic policies are deeply intertwined, and the climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution and resource depletion are basically reshaping the global relations in terms of global agendas, security and economic policies in different ways. And these challenges, of course, are driving both cooperation and conflict between or among the nations, influencing national security strategies and transforming economic system. So as we can see now here, that as the impacts of environmental degradation become more pronounced, their influence on global dynamics will grow and further will demand to address these issues, and it requires more innovative policies, strong international cooperation, and of course a commitment to sustainability and equity. By integrating environmental considerations into diplomacy, security and economic planning, the global community can build further a more resilient and sustainable future. So now these are the activity questions, like how does climate change influence international relations and geopolitical tensions? As I mentioned in the very beginning, in what ways does biodiversity loss creates political and economic challenges for the nation? How does the problem of biodiversity loss creates a challenge in front of the nations, which we have discussed? Thirdly, how has global pollution like plastic waste or air pollution led to diplomatic conflicts or cooperation? And here there is also a question that what roles does resource depletion in form of water scarcity, deforestation play in shaping the national security policies of the governments, which is also mentioned there in the lecture. And lastly, how do environmental challenges drive changes in global trade as well as in economic policies, which we are also seeing that how uh, the governments are bringing several changes while framing their policies related to global trade and economic policy. And these are the references which you may refer as further reading too. Thank you.